Hello and welcome. Today's video will be about the Soviet ZiS-2 57mm anti-tank cannon. Last week, while I was driving through the Poltava region, I passed by an old Victory Park, a Soviet-era memorial to the soldiers of the Second World War, in a small little town of Orzytsia. And from the road, I could see what looked like to be a ZiS-2 cannon, so I had to stop to confirm my suspicion, and I was correct. So I figured I would use this as an opportunity to talk about the ZiS-2, as they are somewhat rare compared to other Soviet cannons and artillery pieces. The story of the ZiS-2 really starts in the Winter War of 1939 to 1940. The Soviet Army's main anti-tank cannon at that time was the 45mm anti-tank cannon Model 1937, or also called the 53-K. This was a very similar design and performance to most nations' light anti-tank cannons of the time. After the Winter War, the Soviet Army Artillery Department noted that due to their usage of heavy tanks in the Winter War, other nations would have probably taken notice, and they might develop similarly armored heavy tanks of their own. Therefore, we should design an anti-tank gun that has better penetration than the 53-K. There is also a chance that German propaganda about super tanks could have influenced this decision. The task would be delegated to Vasily Grubin, head of the Artillery Design Bureau at the Joseph Stalin Factory No. 92 in Gorky. An interesting bit of information about Vasily is that he was one of the first artillery designers to consult with physiologists when designing artillery pieces, to try to make them more ergonomic, before the word ergonomic was ever even used. The development process started in 1940, and the designers decided that the optimal caliber was 57mm. In their opinion, this was the best mix of mass and velocity that could penetrate up to 90mm of rolled homogeneous armor. The cannon was officially adopted on June 1, 1940 as the ZiS-2 Model 1941, ZiS meaning factory named after Stalin. Although by December 1, 1941, it was decided to cease production for a few reasons. To start, the cannons were expensive to make. Secondly, the ammunition was of a new caliber, so it was also expensive to make, and new machines had to be built to make the ammunition, resulting in shortages. And thirdly, the cannons would pierce the weakly armored German medium tanks, and the projectile would go straight out the other side without causing much damage. This is known as overpenetration. And so, the production lines were switched to producing ZiS-3 76mm divisional guns, and an updated 45mm cannon that was said to be better suited for the lightly armored German tanks, and it was cheaper than the ZiS-2. This was the 45mm anti-tank cannon Model 1942. Although, the appearance of the German Tiger I and later the Panther series would change the favor, as it was learned that the 45mm Model 1942 could not consistently penetrate the Panther armor even from the sides or the rear, and it was useless against the Tigers. The ZiS-3 Model 1942 could penetrate the sides of the Panther and the Tiger, but only at distances of 300 meters or less. And so, on June 15, 1943, production was restarted on the ZiS-2, now called the ZiS-2 Model 1943. These cannons could penetrate heavy German tanks from greater distances due to the higher projectile velocity of about 1,000 meters per second versus the ZiS-3's velocity of about 680 meters per second. The ZiS-2 Model 1943 would be produced until 1945, with barely over 10,000 being built, a small number compared to the 103,000 of the ZiS-3. The cannons saw limited use in 1943, particularly at the Battle of Kursk. Increased use in 1944, and by 1945 they saw massively increased use in areas like the battles near Lake Balaton in Hungary and the Battle of Berlin. Here is an interesting story of the use of these cannons. On April 29, 1945, the 320th Guards Anti-Tank Fighter Regiment found itself in the way of German units breaking out of the Halbe pocket. The ensuing battle was reminiscent of battles of the Napoleonic times. The Germans practically had no armored vehicles and attacked the Soviet positions with large masses of infantry, The ZiS-2 crews responded with canister fire from close range. During the battle, the regiment killed up to 420 and captured up to 250 German soldiers and officers, as well as knocking out 2 armored personnel carriers. The Soviet losses from the regiment amounted to 9 soldiers killed and 22 wounded. An interesting case of anti-tank cannons not being used against their intended target type. The ZiS-2 is an automated action gun with a vertical block breech. When firing, the block opens and closes automatically. The loader only has to insert the ammunition into the receiver. With this feature, the rate of fire can reach 25 rounds per minute, although the practical rate is about 10 rounds per minute. The split-tail carriage, gun shield, and cannon together weigh about 1,250 kilograms. The carriage has coil spring suspension, which allows towing with a speed of up to 50 kilometers an hour on highways, 30 kilometers an hour on unpaved roads, and 10 kilometers an hour off-road. The ZiS-2 had a variety of different ammunition types, and we will go through each of them excluding the post-war types and give penetration statistics at a distance of 1,000 meters and an angle of 90 degrees. BR-271 was the earliest type, being used since 1941. It is an armor-piercing capped, ballistic-capped shell with an MD5 fuse and 14 grams of explosive inside. It was capable of piercing 91 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters. BR-271SP was also used since 1941. It is an armor-piercing shell with no fuse and no explosive charge. Its armor penetration capabilities are almost identical to the BR-271. It is the same shell, just without the fuse and explosive charge. O-271 was also used since 1941. It is a fragmentation charge. It can be set to detonate on contact or with a slight delay. Its main purpose was to attack thin-skinned vehicles like trucks and transports and occasionally infantry. In 1943, O-271U was adopted as a replacement. It had a better fuse and additional fragmentation bands. The area of effect is roughly 20 meters wide and 3 meters deep. These rounds need to make contact with an object in order to detonate. BR-271P was also adopted in 1943. It is a sub-caliber shell, which means that the projectile has a smaller diameter than the barrel of the cannon. In this instance, there is a windscreen that is screwed onto the front end of the projectile. This allows it to properly travel down the barrel. This shell had an increased velocity of about 1,270 meters per second, and is capable of penetrating 101 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters. BR-271K was introduced in late 1944. It is an armor-piercing high-explosive shell with an MD5, 7, or 10 fuse, with 18 grams of explosive inside. It is capable of penetrating 74 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters. SHCH-271 was also introduced in 1944. It is a canister shell, meaning it's like a big shotgun. The canister is filled with 324 round pellets weighing about 10.8 grams each. This was designed to help the cannon crews defend themselves against infantry. The area of effect is about 40 meters wide and 200 meters deep. The ZiS-2 had a few variations and adaptations during the Second World War. The ZiS-30 was created by combining a modified ZiS-2 and a Komsomolets armored tractor. It was created out of haste in 1941 during Operation Barbarossa, and only about 100 were ever made. The ZiS-4 was a ZiS-2 slightly modified to fit into a T-34. They were designated T-34-57, and only 10 were produced in 1941, and they were all destroyed fighting around Moscow. Later in 1943, the idea was revisited, but dropped in favor of the T-34-85. The ZiS-2 also had some variations and adaptations in the Cold War era. The ZiS-2N was a modification in 1957 that equipped the ZiS-2 with either an APN-3-55 or APN-57 night vision sights. The ZiS-2 was also modified and updated to be used in the ASU-57, a lightweight, air-droppable tank hunter for the Soviet paratroopers. It was adopted into service in 1950. After World War II, the Soviet Army kept the ZiS-2 in service until the 1970s. They also distributed many of them to Allied nations. They saw combat use with the DPRK in the Korean War, and with Egyptian troops against Israel in the 1956 Suez Crisis. As of 2007, the ZiS-2 was still in service with the armed forces of Algeria, Guinea, Cuba, and Nicaragua. There you have it, the ZiS-2, a relatively small cannon that had a rocky start but ended up seeing large use in the last year of the Second World War, modified to be an airborne tank killer by the VDV, and used by the DPRK, the Egyptians, and many other nations fighting wars around the globe. The ZiS-2 did all of this while being in the shadow of its larger, more well-known brother, the ZiS-3. I think the ZiS-2 is an excellent and interesting piece of military history, and hopefully after this you will think the same. Well, that's it for today. I hope you found this video interesting. Please remember to like and subscribe. Thank you.